So this is Jackson Street, and I have this incredible photo of old Jackson Street from the water, looking up old Jackson Street from the 1800s. I find that absolutely just cool to be here and seeing this the way that it is now 130 years or so later. So point your vision straight out to the water out there. Somebody took a photo of this street 120, 130 years ago. Check out downtown Pioneer Square, the old part of Seattle. The viaduct, the Alaskan Way Viaduct, which was built in the early 1950s, is being dismantled finally. So this old part of Seattle, this old cool part of downtown Seattle, can finally be seen again from the pier. It's amazing. You can see the viaduct over there being dismantled. It was being dismantled because it was just deemed to be an earthquake hazard. This is the same type of freeway that collapsed in that massive earthquake in the Bay Area back in the 80s. Exact same type of double-decker. So there's a remaining section of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, probably still there so that they could keep the walkway intact. The heart of modern downtown Seattle, the historic Pioneer Square area, owes much to an unfortunate minor accident in a carpentry shop by a Swedish man who, by chance, accidentally overturned a glue pot in the process of being heated. Early Seattle was dominated by the logging industry. Because of the easy access to lumber, nearly every building was constructed of the affordable but combustible timber, including docks and even pylons that many of the early buildings were constructed on to raise them above the tide level. During a mid-afternoon on June 6, 1889, a 24-year-old Swedish man working in a carpentry shop accidentally overturned a glue pot in the process of being heated, which caused a local fire that quickly got out of control, spreading to wood chips and turpentine covering the floor. The blaze engulfed the building the carpentry shop was in and then devoured the entire block. As the fire spread, a nearby liquor store caught fire and the abundant alcohol-filled bottles began exploding, increasing the fire's intensity. The fire quickly spread north, engulfing block after block, in part because the wooden boardwalks carry the flames across streets to ignite other blocks. At the time, the water system in Seattle was haphazardly constructed and inadequate to handle the water pressure needed to put out such fires, so they burned with little resistance. By the morning of June 7th, the fire had burned 25 city blocks, about 64 acres, including the entire business district, 4 of the city's wharves, and its railroad terminals. After the fire, the residents of early Seattle, now about 20,000 in number, decided to rebuild the city as quickly as possible. Mayor Robert Moran put in place city codes that required new buildings be built of brick and stone. These are the vintage buildings that now populate Pioneer Square, and many have the year of their construction shown prominently on their facades. The Pioneer Building is one of the finest and most ornate buildings in the district, characteristic of the Richardsonian Romanesque style prevalent throughout Pioneer Square. Constructed in 1889 on the site of Henry Yesler's first home, this building is the most authentic existing example of the work of architect Elmer Fisher. When completed in 1892, this was Seattle's first tall building and the first to use structural steel framing and electric elevators, and was hailed as the finest building west of Chicago by the American Institute of Architects in 1892. So to the left is the Pioneer Building. This is Pioneer Square. This is basically the heart of things. And this triangle parking lot here is often referred to an architectural monstrosity. It's often also referred to as the sinking ship parking lot. There used to be two hotels that existed here that were opulent and beautiful. One was the Seattle Hotel, most recently from about 1890 to 1961. And before that was another hotel that had only been open for maybe 4 years, the Occidental Hotel, and it burned to the ground in the Great Seattle Fire, and it had only been there for maybe 3.5, 4 years. Before that, there was another older hotel that had been built in 1861 and was actually torn down to make way for the new Occidental Hotel. Incredible history. Here's the Cherry Street Coffee House. So cool. Seattle's oldest restaurant, Merchant's Cafe, established 1890. So when you walk around Seattle down in this area, you see that date prominently displayed on many of the buildings, because 150 buildings were built in the wake of the 1889 fire over the course of the next year. So what's kind of amazing about the Pioneer Square area is that it went through this huge boom in the early part of the 20th century, and then by the 1960s it was all but decaying and going away. It was so sad. A lot of these buildings here were derelict and falling apart, and it wasn't until some revitalization efforts took place that it began to really regain the splendor that we see now.
I'll pay you later. Okay.
The Manor Building, 1892. Solid gray brick and stone and fully restored interior paneling mark this Romanesque revival building as one of Pioneer Square's most handsome. Site of Seattle's first bank, operated by pioneer merchant Dexter Horton, the building was restored in 1974 to 1975. Grand Central on the park. That's what it says on the sign of the building there. Grand Central Hotel, 1889. Originally known as the Squire Latimer Building, this structure served as an office space until 1897. At that time, the influx of miners on their way to the Klondike Gold Rush brought about its conversion to the Grand Central Hotel. After years of decline, the building was restored in 1973, site of Squire Opera House. Oh, cool. So, right around the corner is Occidental Park. It's a park that didn't get established officially until 1971, but back in the 1860s, early 1860s, when there was major logging going on up here, apparently everyone would kind of come down to this area where Occidental Park is now, and it was sort of like a major recreation party socialization area, and so that's what I'm walking towards right now. So this is Occidental Park. It's often called Occidental Square too.
We need the lapel.
Nothing's here from before 1889 because of the fire, but just, I love it so much here. There are obviously very new buildings over there, and the totem poles over there, those are relatively recent. I think the 1970s those were put there. And then we swing around, you can see some of the backside of some of the old original buildings from 1889, 1890 here. There's some old writing over here, like old labeling, vintage old businesses that I want to look at. Rainier Beer, that's what it says. So Rainier Beer used to be this big brand of beer in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think it's around anymore. They had some of the very best advertisements on TV for a long time. Look at this. It says, on this site, the Salvation Army commenced work in Seattle on June 5th, 1887. That's really neat. Headquarters of the Seattle Fire Department. The Seattle Fire Department got started as an official city government run and owned entity because of the Great Fire of Seattle of 1889. Up until then, it was all volunteer. And between it being all volunteer and sort of haphazard, the water systems for water hydrants were also woefully inadequate for the task of trying to put out a fire. So the fact that Seattle now has a centralized fire department is because of the Great Fire of Seattle of 1889.